John Quincy Adams was a brilliant diplomat and statesman who became the 6th President of the United States. John Quincy Adams, born on July 11, 1767 in Braintree, Massachusetts, was destined for greatness from birth. He was the son of John Adams, the 2nd President of the United States, and Abigail Adams, one of the most remarkable women in American history. He grew up in a household where politics and public service were not just discussed but lived every single day. Young John Quincy was exposed to the founding of a nation from his earliest years. He witnessed history being made in his own home. John Quincy Adams had an extraordinary education that few Americans of his era could match. When he was just 10 years old, his father took him to Europe, where John Adams was serving as a diplomat for the young American nation. The boy watched his father negotiate with European powers. He learned French, he learned Dutch, he studied in the finest schools of Europe. He attended lectures at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He served as a translator for an American diplomat in Russia before he was even 15 years old. This was not a typical American childhood. This was the education of someone being groomed for international leadership. John Quincy Adams returned to America as a teenager and enrolled at Harvard College. He graduated in 1787 and then studied law. He was admitted to the bar in 1790 and began practicing law in Boston, but the law was not his true calling. In 1794, President George Washington appointed the young John Quincy Adams as minister to the Netherlands. John Quincy was only 26 years old, but he had more diplomatic experience than men twice his age. Washington recognized that this young man had been preparing for diplomatic service his entire life. Adams served in the Netherlands with distinction. He wrote detailed reports about European politics that impressed everyone who read them. His father, John Adams, was now vice president, and some people whispered that nepotism had played a role in the appointment, but John Quincy Adams proved his worth through his own abilities. In 1797, when John Adams became president, he sent his son to serve as minister to Prussia. John Quincy Adams negotiated a treaty with Prussia that was highly favorable to American commercial interests. He was building a reputation as one of America's finest diplomats. While serving in Europe, John Quincy Adams met Louisa Catherine Johnson, the daughter of an American diplomat. They married in London in 1797. Louisa was born in England, and she would later become the only First Lady born outside the United States. Louisa was cultured, refined, and educated. She spoke French fluently. She played the harp beautifully. She was everything a diplomat's wife should be, but her marriage to John Quincy Adams was not always easy. John Quincy could be cold and demanding. He was obsessed with duty and public service. He expected perfection from himself and from everyone around him. Louisa struggled with depression and illness throughout her life. She suffered multiple miscarriages and the death of an infant daughter, but she remained devoted to her husband, and she played a crucial role in his political career. Her social graces complemented his intellectual abilities. In 1801, when Thomas Jefferson became president, John Quincy Adams returned to America. The Federalist Party was losing power, and John Quincy's father had been defeated in his bid for re-election. It was a difficult time for the Adams family, but John Quincy was determined to continue his career in public service. He was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate in 1802 and then to the United States Senate in 1803. As a Federalist senator, John Quincy Adams was expected to oppose President Jefferson and his Democratic-Republican policies, but John Quincy Adams was not a man who followed party lines blindly. He believed in doing what he thought was right regardless of political consequences. He supported Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase even though most Federalists opposed it. He supported Jefferson's embargo policies when most Federalists wanted war with Britain. The Federalist Party in Massachusetts turned against him. They accused him of betraying his party and his class. In 1808, the Massachusetts legislature elected someone else to replace him. John Quincy Adams resigned from the Senate rather than serve out his term. He had chosen principle over party, and it had cost him his political career, or so it seemed. President James Madison recognized John Quincy Adams's talents and his independence. Madison appointed him as the first United States minister to Russia in 1809. Adams spent 5 years in St. Petersburg serving during the Napoleonic Wars. He witnessed Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. He watched the French army march toward Moscow, and he watched the remnants of that army retreat in the brutal Russian winter. Adams maintained good relations with Tsar Alexander I. He worked to keep Russia friendly to American interests even as America was fighting the War of 1812 against Britain. Adams's wife Louisa hated St. Petersburg. The cold climate affected her health. The isolation depressed her. Their young daughter died there, but John Quincy Adams remained focused on his diplomatic mission. He believed that serving his country was more important than personal comfort. In 1814, President Madison called Adams to serve as the chief negotiator for the Treaty of Ghent, which would end the War of 1812. Adams led a team of American negotiators that included Henry Clay and Albert Gallatin. They met with British negotiators in the city of Ghent in present-day Belgium. The negotiations were difficult. The British made extensive demands. They wanted territory in Maine and along the Great Lakes. They wanted to create an Indian buffer state in the Northwest Territory. They wanted navigation rights on the Mississippi River. Adams refused to accept these terms. He was patient, he was stubborn, he was willing to let the negotiations drag on for months. The British finally realized that continuing the war would be too expensive. They agreed to a peace treaty that essentially restored the status quo before the war. It was not a great victory for America, but it was not a defeat either. Adams had achieved an honorable peace. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve 1814, and it made John Quincy Adams a national hero. After the Treaty of Ghent, Adams was appointed minister to Great Britain. He served in London from 1815 to 1817. He negotiated several important agreements with the British, including treaties about fishing rights and the Canadian border, but his time in London was brief. In 1817, the newly elected President James Monroe asked Adams to serve as Secretary of State. Adams accepted immediately. The position of Secretary of State was considered the stepping stone to the presidency. Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe had all served as Secretary of State before becoming President. Adams knew that this appointment could lead to the highest office in the land. As Secretary of State from 1817 to 1825, John Quincy Adams achieved more than perhaps any other person who ever held that position. He negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty with Spain in 1819, which acquired Florida for the United States and established the boundary between the United States and Spanish Mexico. The treaty extended American claims all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was one of the greatest diplomatic achievements in American history. Adams also worked with President Monroe to develop what became known as the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine declared that the United States would not tolerate European colonization or interference in the Americas. It was a bold statement of American power and independence. Adams wrote much of the doctrine, and he believed it was essential to protecting American interests in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine would shape American foreign policy for more than a century. Adams also negotiated treaties with Britain that established the boundary between the United States and Canada along the 49th parallel. He secured American fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. He opened American trade with the British West Indies. He was involved in every major foreign policy decision of the Monroe administration. His knowledge of international affairs was unmatched. His command of languages allowed him to read diplomatic correspondence in the original French, Spanish, Dutch, and other languages. His experience in European courts gave him insights that no other American possessed. He was without question the most qualified diplomat in American history. In 1824, John Quincy Adams ran for president. The election of 1824 was one of the most controversial in American history. There were four major candidates: Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, Henry Clay of Kentucky, William Crawford of Georgia, and John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. All four men were members of the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalist Party had essentially disappeared. Adams ran on his record of diplomatic achievement and public service. He was not a natural campaigner. He was stiff and formal in public. He did not enjoy shaking hands and kissing babies. He believed that his record should speak for itself. This was not the way to win elections in the new democratic age of American politics. When the votes were counted, Andrew Jackson had won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but he did not have a majority of the electoral votes. The Constitution required that the election be decided by the House of Representatives, where each state would cast one vote. Henry Clay, who had finished fourth, was eliminated from consideration as Speaker of the House. Clay had enormous influence over the outcome. Clay did not like Andrew Jackson. He thought Jackson was unqualified to be President. Clay believed that Adams was the best qualified candidate. Clay threw his support to Adams, and Adams was elected president by the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson and his supporters were furious. They accused Adams and Clay of making a corrupt bargain. When Adams appointed Clay as his Secretary of State, the charges of corruption seemed confirmed. Jackson supporters vowed to oppose everything Adams tried to do. They began campaigning for the 1828 election immediately. John Quincy Adams was inaugurated as the sixth President of the United States on March 4, 1825. He was 57 years old. He had spent almost his entire life in public service. He had more experience in government and diplomacy than any previous president. He had a vision for America that was ambitious and forward-thinking. Adams believed that the federal government should play an active role in developing the nation's economy and infrastructure. He proposed building roads and canals to connect different parts of the country. He wanted to establish a national university. He wanted to fund scientific expeditions. He wanted to create a national observatory. He wanted the government to promote education and the arts and sciences. Adams believed that America should not just be powerful but should be enlightened and cultured as well. But Adams's presidency was a failure almost from the beginning. The political opposition led by Andrew Jackson and his supporters blocked almost everything Adams tried to do. They controlled Congress and they refused to pass Adams's legislative proposals. The charges of